Hello, hi. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host. Thank you for joining this episode today. Over the weekend, I was asked, what would I do with this podcast if there were no more murder stories to talk about? And I'll tell you how I responded to that. First of all, I'd be ecstatic. No more murder stories means no more murder, so that would make me happy. So the podcast would probably transition to something like, I don't know, I could take up crocheting. We could talk about crocheting. I don't know how to do that, but we could figure it out together, right? Or I know zero things about soccer, and the city that I live in just got a soccer team, club, what do you call it? I guess it's a club, team, I don't know, but we got one, and I want to go to some games, but I know nothing about what's happening. So it could be a podcast talking about my journey to figuring out how soccer works. I don't know, but the point is, it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Even if you believe in the Bible, which I'm not about to preach at you, so don't tune away, but if you believe in the Bible, there was Adam, and then Eve came from Adam, and then they had two kids. They had Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel. So at one time, you had 4 people on the planet total, and one of them killed another one. So in the beginning of people times, you had murder. And even if you don't believe in the Bible, you know that even before the written history, people were killing each other. So unfortunately, the podcast is going to stick around because murder almost seems inevitable. And it sounds depressing to say, but it is the reality. So if you've got more thought-provoking questions to ask me, joe@10minutemurder.com. That's my email address. And that's also, by the way, the best way to send me a story idea that you'd like to be talked about on this podcast, joe@10minutemurder.com. And if this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new ones. Connect with me on social media. See the visuals that we're talking about here on the podcast. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is very much appreciated. You can go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to 10-Minute Murder. Now to today's story. It was the 13th of November, 1961, when a crew member aboard an oil tanker noticed a dinghy floating nearby. A man stood on it, waving his arms in the air and screaming for help. "I have a dead baby on board," he yelled. The crew of the tanker could see the small corpse of a red-headed child laying aboard the dinghy. As the oil tanker approached, the man told them that his name was Julian Harvey. Julian told the crew that he was a skipper for a vessel named the Bluebelle until it sank the previous evening. The main mast had snapped, skewering the hull of the ship and separating Julian from the ship's other passengers, including his own wife, who was working as a cook. Before Julian was able to do anything more, the ship had suddenly burst into flames. Julian managed to escape the burning wreckage by climbing aboard the Bluebelle's dinghy. The dead child that he had with him, Renee Duperrault, had floated past him during the escape. He grabbed the child and tried to resuscitate her, but his attempts had not worked. He kept her with him overnight, unable to bring himself to leave a small child's body at sea. After some initial questioning about the incident and the fates of the other passengers, Julian was given permission to travel back to his home base in Miami, where the local Coast Guard would carry out further questioning. He told his story again: the fallen mast due to bad weather, the puncture in the hull, and the fire, which he believed was due to a rupture in the gas tank. With no other survivors to question, the Coast Guard had no choice but to believe him, although one aspect of the story raised all of their eyebrows. The dinghy that Julian had boarded had been incredibly well stocked with survival supplies. On the 17th of November, Julian Harvey received a piece of impossible news. A survivor from the Bluebelle had been found. The survivor, an 11-year-old girl named Terry Jo Duperrault. She had managed to cling to a cork dinghy to keep herself afloat. Despite spending an estimated 82 hours exposed to the elements in the open ocean without food or drinking water, Terry Jo became the ship's only survivor. The young girl had been spotted by a Greek freighter, dressed only in a thin cotton shirt and corduroy pants. Despite her weak state, Terry Jo waved out to the ship for help as sharks circled around her tiny vessel. Once the freighter's crew lifted Terry Jo on board, they tried to hydrate her with water and juice, while wiping the salt off of her body. Terry Jo's condition had quickly deteriorated as she became unresponsive, but after being airlifted to a hospital, she began to recover. Against the odds, she regained her strength and became able to speak about her ordeal. During one of Julian's interrogations, he was given the good news. There had been a miracle, and Terry Jo had been rescued alive. Minutes later, Julian told the interrogator that he wasn't feeling well and wanted to be excused for the rest of the day. He made his way to a nearby motel, giving them a fake name and paying cash. After writing a 2-page long note, he committed suicide by self-inflicting wounds to his ankles, thighs, and neck. It seemed as if the number of cuts he made to his body acted as kind of an insurance policy. Under no circumstances did Julian Harvey want to survive his suicide attempt. He already knew what Terry Jo was going to say. Julian's body was found only hours later. The suicide note surprisingly did not give any insight as to why he had decided to take his own life. It only stated, quote, "I got too tired and nervous. I couldn't stand it any longer," and asked that his remains be buried at sea. With Julian dead and Terry Jo able to give her version of events, investigators were finally able to hear the real story of what happened that night aboard the Bluebelle. At the age of 40, Arthur Duperrault had finally saved the money to take his family on the adventure of a lifetime, a week-long cruise on a chartered yacht, traveling from Florida to the Bahamas. It was a much-needed escape from the brutal winters that Arthur and his family faced back home in Wisconsin, and in November of 1961, they were finally able to set sail. For a fee of $515, the Duperrault family had been able to charter a 60-foot catch vessel named the Bluebelle, and an additional fee of $100 per day to the man that would be the Bluebelle's skipper on the voyage, an experienced, reputable local yachtsman named Julian Harvey. The Bluebelle left port in the Florida Keys on November 8, 1961. The Duperrault family relaxed on board and visited a range of tourist destinations to snorkel, sightsee, and go shopping for souvenirs. They finally made their port of call on November 12th before beginning the journey back to their starting point in Florida. That night, the ship's inhabitants had an Italian chicken dish with salad for dinner. For almost everybody on board, it would be their last meal. Leaving the rest of the family relaxing on deck, Terry Jo retired to her below-deck sleeping cabin at 9 p.m. Shortly afterwards, Terry Jo woke to the sounds of yelling and thumping. She crept above deck to investigate and saw the dead bodies of her mother and brother slumped in the Bluebelle's main cabin. Still sleepy, Terry Jo couldn't process what was happening and walked further onto the ship's deck, where she saw Julian Harvey holding a bucket. He saw her and violently shoved Terry Jo back below deck. She did as she was told, and minutes later, a mixture of water and oil began flowing down onto her cabin's floor. Shortly afterwards, Julian walked into the cabin holding a rifle. He made eye contact with a terrified Terry Jo and then left. Terry Jo worked up the courage to creep back out of her cabin, where she saw that Julian had released the Bluebelle's dinghy, which was floating to the side of the ship. He asked her to hold the rope that tethered the dinghy in place, but she lost her grip and the rope slid out into the sea. Panicked, Julian jumped overboard to swim out to the dinghy, leaving Terry Jo behind. She was now the sole living person on board a sinking ship. Despite her young age and the terror she was experiencing, Terry Jo was a determined, resourceful kid. As the Bluebelle began to sink faster, she untied a float from the deck and threw it overboard and swam towards it. The float was tiny. The only way Terry Jo could fit on it was by sitting completely upright. She managed to sit in the same position while sleep-deprived and starving until her rescue more than 3 days later. No part of Terry Jo's story supported Julian's version of events. Over and over, she insisted that the Bluebelle's mast had never broken and there had never been any kind of fire on board. Authorities gently informed Terry Jo of their findings. They had recovered her sister Renee's body, as well as Julian Harvey, but the other members of her family were all lost at sea. With the combination of Terry Jo's testimony and Julian's immediate guilty suicide, it was clear to investigators that foul play had caused the deaths of those on board the Bluebelle. Investigation into Julian found that, despite his good reputation as a yachtsman, he'd always struggled to hold down a job and had financial problems throughout his life. He had a history of collecting large insurance settlements from the sinking of boats, and one of his previous wives had died when Julian drove his car off of a bridge, leaving her in the water to drown while he made his way to safety. With this story in mind, an inquiry into Julian's actions proposed one main theory. His motivation had actually been to collect on his wife's double indemnity life insurance policy for a supposed accidental death. If his plan had gone successfully, she might have been the only victim. Possibly a member of the Duperrault family had caught Julian in the act, forcing him to kill the rest of the family as potential witnesses. 5 decades after escaping the Bluebelle, Terry Jo gave an interview where she stated why she believed Julian spared her life. She didn't think that it was mercy at all. Matter-of-factly, she said, quote, "I think he probably thought I would go down with the ship." And if she had, Julian Harvey would have lived his life as a free man.